Apple has spent billions of dollars to reinvent the MacBook over the past 2 years with a new design and a new processor. But there's one secret chip that could redefine the MacBook forever. And this secret chip is actually 3 chips in one, which will absolutely change how we use our MacBooks forever. This is the M2 Pro, it's the M2 Max, and the M2 Ultra. Let's discuss these 3 chips because they're incredible. So the first thing you should know about these 3 chips is that Apple created all of them using the same 3nm process from TSMC. These chips are very impressive thanks to this manufacturing process, which increases transistor density, allows for smaller transistors, and leads to lower power consumption, which is a huge deal when it comes to laptops. This means that Apple was able to pack a ton of processing power into the new MacBook Pros, while keeping them cooler and quieter than ever before. And the best part is that Apple still uses a fanless design. The new M2 Pro and M2 Max chips are now available today in the new 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, and the M2 Ultra chip will be coming soon in the next Mac Studio, and possibly a new high-end Mac Pro as well. So let's talk about what makes these chips so special. First up, we have the M2 Pro, and as you can see, it has an 11-core CPU compared to the M1 Pro's 8-core CPU, and this means that the M2 Pro chip is 40% faster than its predecessor. The M2 Pro also features a 19-core GPU compared to the M1 Pro's 14-core GPU, making it 30% faster. So you'll be getting a nice performance boost across the board with this chip. But the M2 Pro has some other tricks up its sleeve as well. For example, it now has a 16-core neural engine, compared to the M1 Pro's 16-core neural engine. Now you might ask yourself, why does the neural engine matter? Well, the neural engine is used for machine learning tasks like image recognition and natural language processing, and Apple says that it's up to 40% faster for these tasks. So if you do a lot of photo or video editing, then the neural engine will definitely come in handy here. Also, Apple upgraded the media engine quite a bit. It now supports encoding and decoding of multiple streams of ProRes for K10-bit video and ProRes RAW photos. You can now also transcode H.265 footage, which is great. But probably the most notable upgrade is that the M2 Pro now supports up to 8,000 video recording at 30 frames per second, or up to 4,000 video recording at 240 frames per second. That's pretty impressive. Now the M2 Pro only has one ProRes accelerator, which is a bit of a bummer. But aside from that, it's a really powerful chip. If you don't need the extra power of the M2 Max or the M2 Ultra, then the M2 Pro is definitely the way to go and represents the perfect upgrade from the M1 Pro. However, if you need even more power, then you'll want to check out the new M2 Max chip. The M2 Max has the same 11-core CPU as the M2 Pro, but it doubles the GPU cores to 38, making it up to 30% faster than the M1 Max. It also features 2 ProRes accelerators for faster ProRes, video encoding and decoding, and a much larger memory bandwidth of 400 gigabytes per second. The M2 Max also has an updated media engine that adds support for encoding and decoding up to 3 streams of ProRes 4K 10-bit video and ProRes RAW photos. And similar to the M2 Pro, it can also transcode H.265 footage. The M2 Max also has the same 16-core neural engine as the M2 Pro. If you compare the M2 Max and the M2 Pro side by side, then it becomes clear that the main difference between these 2 chips is the amount of GPU cores. If you don't need the additional GPU cores, then the M2 Pro is a better choice since it's a bit cheaper, and it also has a slightly higher single-core performance. But if you need those additional GPU cores, then the M2 Max is the way to go. I personally use my MacBooks for everything from writing scripts for YouTube, videos to editing 8K drone footage, to exporting 4K time-lapses, and obviously browsing the web and checking emails and messages. And the M2 Max performs flawlessly for all of these tasks. I've been testing out the new 14-inch MacBook Pro and the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and they both perform amazing. But now, let's talk about the M2 Ultra chip. The M2 Ultra combines 2 M2 Max chips into one package, and that's why it's up to twice as fast as the M1 Ultra when it comes to the GPU. It features 72 GPU cores, and it's available in the upcoming Mac Studio and the new Mac Pro. And just like the M2 Max, the M2 Ultra comes with 2 ProRes accelerators and a 400 gigabytes per second memory bandwidth. The M2 Ultra also has 2 times the unified memory of the M2 Max, 128 gigabytes instead of 64 gigabytes. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to, since I often run into memory limitations when editing large projects. And if that wasn't enough, the M2 Ultra also features 2 times the number of ports. For Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB, 2 HDMI ports, and 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports. So when it comes to sheer performance, the M2 Ultra chip is extremely impressive. However, one thing that Apple didn't mention during their keynote is the exact clock speed of the M2 Ultra. And when we take a look at Geekbench 5, you can see that it actually runs at a significantly lower clock speed than the M1 Ultra. So this got me wondering, how does the M2 Ultra compare to the M1 Ultra when it comes to actual real-world performance? To answer that question, I went ahead and ran a few tests myself. So here are my test results.
Wow.
For single-core performance, the M2 Ultra scored 1873 points, while the M1 Ultra scored 1748 points. That's just a 7% improvement with the M2 Ultra. When it comes to multi-core performance, things get interesting. The M2 Ultra scored 24,136 points, while the M1 Ultra scored 23,836 points. So that's just a 1.3% improvement. However, when it comes to GPU performance, things get much more interesting. The M2 Ultra scored 160,000.929 points, while the M1 Ultra scored 139,000.848 points. So that's a 15% improvement in GPU performance. So what does this mean for us? Well, the M2 Ultra is a good upgrade over the M1 Ultra when it comes to GPU performance, but not so much when it comes to CPU performance. So that got me thinking, what if we take the M2 Max and compare it to the M1 Max, since they both have the same amount of CPU cores? Well, let's take a look. The M2 Max scored 1791 points for single-core performance and 138,342 points for multi-core performance, which means that it's 4% faster than the M1 Max in single-core performance and almost 15% faster in multi-core performance. That's pretty impressive considering that the M2 Max is $200 cheaper than the M1 Max, so that makes the M2 Max a much better value than the M2 Ultra. And that brings me to the conclusion that Apple's best chip is actually the M2 Max and not the M2 Ultra. Of course, the M2 Ultra is an incredible chip. It's mostly designed for people who absolutely need the fastest possible performance. But for most users, the M2 Max is the sweet spot. When it comes to price and performance, and the fact that it's available in the new 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook, pros means that you have the option to get incredible performance in a portable and fanless design. And if you're wondering if the M2 Pro is worth it over the M2 Max, then watch this video where I compare them side by side. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.